Eternal recurrence. The fundamental problem of being, that is the enigmas of birth and death, of coming into existence and of disappearance, never leave man. Whatever we may think about, we are actually thinking of these enigmas or problems. Even when we decide within ourselves to leave these questions alone, in reality we seize upon every possibility, even the most remote, and try once more to understand something in the enigmas that we had recognized to be insoluble. Speaking generally, by their attitude towards the problems of life and death, people can be divided into two categories. Most people approach these problems just as they approach all other problems and somehow solve them for themselves either positively or negatively. In order to arrive at these solutions, they use ordinary methods of thought, the same methods and the same categories of thought as they use for thinking of ordinary things that happen in everyday life. They say either that after death there will be nothing, that beyond the threshold of death there is not and cannot be any existence, or else that there will be an existence of some sort, either like the earthly existence or different from it, and consisting either entirely of suffering or entirely of joy. However, others know more than that. They realize that the problems of life and death cannot be approached in an ordinary way, and that it is impossible to think of these problems in the same way in which people think of something that happened yesterday, or will happen tomorrow. However, they do not go further than this. They feel that it is impossible, or at any rate useless, to think of these things simply, but what it means to think not simply they do not know. In order to arrive at the correct attitude towards these problems, it is necessary to remember that they are connected with the idea of time. We understand these problems to the extent to which we understand time. From the ordinary standpoint, our life is taken as a line from birth to death. A person was born, lived 50 years and died. But where they were before 1950 and where they may be after the year 2000 is not known. This is the general formulation of all questions of life and death. Science and philosophy do not take these questions seriously and consider them naive. Religious teachings, various pseudo-occult and theosophical systems claim to know the solutions to these problems. In reality, of course, no one knows anything. The mystery of existence before birth and existence after death, if there is such existence, is the mystery of time. But then, of course, time guards its secrets better than many people think, and in order to approach these mysteries it is necessary to understand time itself. All ordinary attempts to answer questions about what was before and what will be after are based upon an ordinary concept of time. And the same formula is applied to the problems of existence before birth and after death, whenever such existence is admitted, i.e. the formula is taken as illustrated. It is precisely here that the fundamental mistake lies. Time in the sense of before, now, after is the product of our life, of our being, of our perception and above all, of our thinking. Outside of this, outside the usual perception, the interrelation of the three phases of time can change. At the very least we have no guarantee that they will remain the same. Yet in ordinary thought, including religious, theosophical and occult thought, this question is never even raised. Time is regarded as something that is not subject to discussion, as something that belongs to us once and for all and cannot be taken away from us, more importantly, something which is always the same. Whatever may happen to us, time will always belong to us, and not only time, but even eternity. Neither do we know what eternity is, and take it to be an infinite extension of time, that really renders the very term eternity quite unnecessary. In the 19th century, certain Eastern and pseudo-Eastern theories began to penetrate Western thought, among others the idea of reincarnation, that is, of the periodical presence on Earth of the same essence. This idea was not entirely unknown before, but belonged to hidden mystical thought. The popularization of the concept is chiefly due to modern theosophy with all of its ramifications. The origin of the idea of reincarnation as it is expounded in modern theosophy is open to argument. It was adopted by theosophists practically without alteration from the cult of Krishna, which is a religion of Vedic origin, considerably retouched by reformers. However, even the cult of Krishna does not contain the democratic principle of general and equal reincarnation, which is so characteristic of modern theosophy. In the real cult of Krishna, only heroes, leaders, and teachers of humanity reincarnate. Reincarnation for the masses, for the crowd, for householders, assumes vaguer forms. Side by side with the idea of reincarnation there exists in India the idea of the transmigration of souls, i.e. the reincarnation of the spirit of human beings into animals. The idea of the transmigration of souls connects reincarnation with reward and punishment. Theosophists regard the transmigration of souls as a distortion of the idea of reincarnation by popular belief, however this can in no way be regarded as certain. Both the idea of reincarnation and the belief in the transmigration of souls may be regarded as having originated from one common source, namely the teaching of the repetition of everything, and of eternal recurrence. The idea of the eternal recurrence of things and phenomena, the idea of eternal repetition, is connected in European thought with the name of Pythagoras, and with the vague notions of the periodicity of the universe that are found in Indian philosophy and cosmogony. This idea of periodicity cannot be clear to European thought, because it becomes complete and connected only with the aid of oral commentaries that up to the present time, have never and nowhere been made public. The life of Brahma, the days and nights of Brahma, the breath of Brahma, Kalpa and Manvantaras, all these ideas are very obscure for European thought, but by their inner content they are invariably associated with Pythagorean ideas of eternal recurrence. The name of Gautama the Buddha, who was almost if not exactly a contemporary of Pythagoras, and who also taught eternal recurrence, is very seldom mentioned in connection with this idea. In spite of the fact that in the Buddha's teaching of the Wheel of Lives, the idea is clearer than anywhere else, although it is obscured almost beyond recognition by ignorant interpretations and translations. Nietzsche contributed a great deal to the popularization of the idea of eternal recurrence, but has added nothing new to it. On the contrary, he introduced several wrong concepts, as for instance his calculation, which mathematically is altogether wrong, of the mathematical necessity for the repetition of identical worlds in the universe. Nietzsche attempts to prove the necessity for repetition in Euclidean space and in ordinary, i.e. one-dimensional time. His understanding of the idea of repetition was that somewhere in the infinite space of the universe, an Earth exactly like the one that we live on must be repeated. Then the same cause will create the same effects, and as a result there will be a room somewhere, exactly like that in which I am now sitting, and in that room a man exactly like me with an exactly similar computer will type what I am now typing. Such a construction is possible only with a naive understanding of time. Nietzsche proves the necessity for repetition roughly in the following way. According to him, if we take a certain number of units and examine their possible combinations, the combinations that occurred once are bound to recur in the course of time. If the number of units is large, repetitions will be more frequent, and if the number of units is infinite, everything is bound to repeat. This is wrong though simply because Nietzsche fails to see that the number of possible combinations will grow in a much higher ratio than the number of units. Consequently, the number of possible repetitions, instead of increasing, will actually diminish. Thus, with a certain not even infinite but merely large number of units, the number of combinations will be infinite and the probability of repetition will equal 0. Given an infinite number of units, even the possibility of repetition is out of the question. However, although he made mistakes in the attempts to prove his theories, Nietzsche felt the idea of eternal recurrence with strong emotions. He felt the idea as a poet. Several passages in his Zarathustra and in other books where he touches upon the idea are perhaps the best he ever wrote. Repetition cannot be proven on our plane, that is in the three-dimensional world with time as the fourth dimension. No matter whether time is taken as a real or even as an imaginary quantity, because repetition requires 5 dimensions, i.e. an entirely new space-time eternity. The Pythagorean ideas of the repetition of everything were referred to, among others by Eudemus, a pupil of Aristotle. Eudemus's physics has been lost to time, and what he wrote about the Pythagoreans is known to us only through the latter commentaries of Simplicius. It is interesting to observe that according to Eudemus, the Pythagoreans distinguish 2 kinds of repetition. Simplicius wrote, "The Pythagoreans said that the same things are repeated again and again." In this regard it is worth noting the words of Eudemus, Aristotle's disciple, in the 3rd book of Physics. He states that, some people accept and some people deny that time repeats itself. repetition is understood in different senses. One kind of repetition may be in the natural order of things, like the repetition of summers and winters or other seasons. When a new one comes after another has disappeared. To this order of things belong the movements of the heavenly bodies, and the phenomena produced by them such as solstices and equinoxes, which are produced by the movement of the sun. But if we are to believe the Pythagoreans, there is another kind of repetition in quantity, in which the same things exist a number of times. That means that I shall talk to you and sit exactly like this, and I shall have in my hands the same mala beads and everything will be the same as it is now. This makes it possible to suppose that there exists no difference in time, because if the movements of heavenly bodies and many other things are the same, then what occurred before and what will occur afterwards are also the same. This applies also to their number, which is always the same. Everything is the same and therefore time is the same. The preceding passage from Simplicius is particularly interesting in that it gives a key for the translation of other Pythagorean fragments. That is, notes on Pythagoras and his teachings that have been preserved by certain authors. The basis of the view on Pythagoras that is accepted in textbooks on the history of philosophy is the idea that in the philosophy of Pythagoras and in his concept of the world, the chief place was occupied by number. In reality, it is simply a bad translation. The word number is in fact constantly met within Pythagorean fragments. But only the word, and in most cases this word merely completes verbs that do not express the repeated or iterative action that the author aims at describing. At the same time, this word is always translated as having independent significance, which entirely distorts its meaning. The preceding passage from Simplicius loses all meaning in the usual translation. These two kinds of repetition, which Eudemus called repetition in the natural order of things, and repetition in number of existences, are of course repetition in time, and repetition in eternity. It follows from this that the Pythagoreans distinguished between these two ideas, which are confused by modern Buddhists and were confused by Nietzsche. Jesus undoubtedly knew of repetition and spoke of it with his disciples. In the Gospels there are many allusions to this, but the most unquestionable passage that has a quite definite meaning in Greek, Slavonic, and German texts, has lost its meaning in translation into other languages, which took the most important word from the Latin translation. And Jesus said unto them, Verily I say unto you, that ye which have followed me, in the regeneration. See Matthew, chapter 19, verse 18. In German the words are translated in der Wiedergeburt. In Greek, Slavonic, and Russian the German Wiedergeburt can be translated only as repeated existence or again existence, repeated birth or again birth. In Latin this word was translated regeneratio, which in the initial meaning corresponded to repeated birth. But later, owing to the use of the word regeneratio, and its derivatives in the sense of renovation, it lost its original meaning. The Apostle Paul undoubtedly knew of the idea of repetition, but he had a negative attitude towards it. This idea was too esoteric for him. For Christ is not entered into the holy places made with hands. Nor yet that he should offer himself often. As the high priest entereth in the holy place every year with blood of others, for then must he often have suffered since the foundation of the world, but now once in the end of the world hath he appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. See Hebrews, chapter 9 verses 24 to 26. It must be noted here that the epistle to the Hebrews is ascribed also to certain other authors as well as to the Apostle Paul, and that there really is no definite information on the question. Origen, of the 3rd century, in his book on First Principles, also refers to the idea of repetition, but speaks about it negatively. And now I do not understand by what proofs they can maintain their position, who assert that worlds sometimes come into existence which are not dissimilar to each other, but in all respect equal. For if there is said to be a world similar in all respects to the present, then it will come to pass that Adam and Eve will do the same things which they did before. There will be a second time the same deluge, and the same Moses will again lead a nation numbering nearly 600,000 out of Egypt. Judas will also a second time betray the Lord. Paul will a second time keep the garments of those who stoned Stephen. And everything which has been done in this life will be said to be repeated. See Origen, Book 2, Chapter 3 on the Writings of Origen, translated by the Reverend Frederick Crombie and published by T&T Clark, in Edinburgh, 1878. Reference Volume 1, page 84. There are two interesting poems on the same subject. One is by Alexis Tolstoy. Translated by the Honourable Maurice Baring. The Oxford Book of Russian Verse. Through the slush and the ruts of the roadway. By the side of the dam of the stream. Where the wet fish nets are drying, the carriage jogs on and I muse. I muse and I look at the roadway, at the damp and the dull grey weather. At the shelving bank of the lake, and the far-off smoke of the villages. By the dam with a cheerless face, is walking a tattered old Jew. From the lake with a splashing of foam, the waters rush through the weir. A little boy plays on a pipe. He has made it out of a reed. The startled wild ducks have flown, and call as they sweep from the lake. Near the old tumbling-down mill, some labourers sit on the grass. An old worn horse and a cart is lazily dragging some sacks. And I know it all, oh so well. Though I never have been here before. The roof there, far away yonder, and the boy, and the wood, and the weir. And the mournful voice of the mill. And the crumbling barn in the field. I have been here and seen it before, and forgotten it all long ago. This very same horse plodded on. It was dragging the very same sacks. And under the mouldering mill, the labourers sat on the grass. And the Jew with his beard walked by. And the weir made just such a noise. All this happened before, only I cannot tell when. The other poem is by D.G. Rossetti. Sudden Light. I have been here before, but when or how I cannot tell. I know the grass beyond the door, the sweet keen smell, the sighing sound, the lights around the shore. You have been mine before. How long ago I may not know. But just when at that swallow saw, your neck turned so, some veil did fall, I knew it all of yore. Then, now, perchance again. Oh, round mine eyes your tresses shake. Shall we not lie as we have lain, thus for love's sake, and sleep, and wake, yet never break the chain? There is a variant to this last stanza. Has this been thus before, and shall not thus time's eddying flight still with our lives our love restore in death's despite? And day and night yield one delight once more. Both poems were written in the 1850s. Tolstoy's poem is usually regarded as simply recording strange passing moods. But Leo Tolstoy, who was interested in mystical literature and in contact with several occult circles that existed in Europe at his time, may have known of the idea of eternal recurrence. The feeling of the repetition of events was also very strong in Lermontov. He is full of presentiments, expectations, and memories of déjà vu. He constantly alludes to these sensations, particularly in his prose. The Fatalist is practically written on the theme of repetition and of remembering that which seems to have happened in some unknown past. Many passages in The Princess and in Bela, particularly the philosophical digressions, produce the impression that Lermontov himself is trying to remember something that he has half forgotten. We think in general that we know Lermontov, but who has asked themselves what the following passage in Bela means? I was exhilarated to find myself so high above the world. It was a childish feeling, of course, but when we get away from artificial conditions and approach nearer to nature, we cannot help becoming children. All that we have acquired falls away from our being, and we become once more what we were, and what we one day shall assuredly be again. A Hero of Our Time, by M.Y. Lermontov, published by Philip Allen in London, 1928. See Bela, pages 49 and 50. I do not know of a single attempt to analyze these words in all the literature on Lermontov. But the idea of the possibility of some kind of return undoubtedly disturbed Lermontov, now carried him away and now appeared as an unrealizable dream. Would it not be better to finish the path of life in self-forgetting, and to fall into an unending sleep, looking for a near awakening? Valeric. In the modern era, the idea of recurrence and even the possibility of half-conscious remembering becomes more and more pressing and necessary. In The Life of Napoleon, published in 1928, D.S. Merejkovsky constantly alludes to Napoleon in the phrases, he knew, remembered. Later, in dealing with Napoleon's last years in Europe, he forgot, he ceased to remember. This list does not claim to be complete. It is necessary only to show that the idea of repetition and recollection of the past, which is not in our time, is far from being foreign to Western thought. However, the psychological apprehension of the idea of eternal recurrence does not necessarily lead to a logical understanding and explanation of it. In order to understand the idea of eternal recurrence and its different aspects, it is necessary to return to the ideas of the new model of the universe.